This is Andy McCullough, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, cool. I love it. We get to talk about the Dodgers. One of my favorite things to do is talk about baseball. And I was at one point an emerging baseball writer, and careers, and it's really hard to make money doing that. As you know, this sports reporting world is completely changed from when it was when I graduated from college. I don't know, 35 years ago.
I can imagine. Yeah.
It's a different world.
I can imagine.
Yeah. How did you get to do this story? Like, is it your idea? Did someone suggest it? Did Clayton come to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been interested in in writing a book for a long time. I mean, I've been a baseball writer for 15 years and was kind of trying to figure out, a project that was really worth sinking my teeth into. And I had some conversations with him, so I covered the Dodgers for several years for the LA Times. And so that's how, initially wrote about Kershaw a lot, obviously, because he's the most important player on those teams. And I had some conversations with him during the 2021 postseason when he was, wasn't able to pitch and was, recovering from an elbow injury, where I got the sense he was maybe a little bit more reflective than he had been in the past, maybe a little bit more, because he's a pretty guarded person, fairly private person. And so, but I got the sense, that he was a little bit more open to, sharing some of his perspective. And so I approached him in May of 2022 to see if he was, interested in this. I mean, I told him I wanted to write a book about him, that the book would be better if he participated. And he was, said, yeah, sounds good, and there was no real serious negotiation. We talked for maybe 5-10 minutes and agreed to, meet up at the end of, in the winter of 2022. And so spent some time in Texas with him at that point, and then met up with him several times, during the course of last year, in addition to other reporting. And so, yeah, it wasn't really an elaborate sort of approach. It was just, kind of went to him directly, and he was up for it.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable. I mean, he is not, like you said, he's pretty guarded. Would you say guarded is even on the friendly and happier side of how he approaches his public persona, or is guarded pretty fair?
No, I mean, yeah, I think he's, he's very polite. That's for sure. But, he also, his post-game interviews he's not the most expansive person, I would say. And he's very controlled, I think, and doesn't say more than what he wants to say when, you're having a conversation with him, when you're doing a, on the record sort of interview. But I think that he's always, sort of polite and reasonable about, making time to talk to people. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about Andy's new book. It's coming out here in a couple of days, The Last of His Kind. That's Clayton Kershaw, and the book's about him. And Andy does a great job kind of grabbing what really is the last of an era in terms of how pitchers approach things. Sort of similar to Verlander, sort of similar to Scherzer, and Greinke's in the book. All these guys are mentioned, but he is sort of a unique character in his steadfastness and how he approaches it. How would you separate that four-group pitcher? I mean, these are all Hall of Fame caliber players. How would you separate them in terms of being of a kind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are very clearly the four Hall of Fame pitchers of this sort of era. And I think Verlander, Scherzer, and Kershaw are on a probably separate tier than Greinke, which is not really an insult to Greinke. He's just slightly below those guys.
Sure.
And I think that what is interesting to me about Kershaw compared to those three is that they have sort of succeeded deeper into their careers through reinvention. Whether Verlander really changed up his mix over the years, Scherzer, did the same. Greinke is always, before I guess he's not retired, but he's basically, it seems like he's done. He's not pitching this year. Greinke sort of reinvented himself every 3 or 4 years. And Kershaw kind of does the same things he did when he was 20 years old. He's better at them. He's made slight variations along the way. He's, he added a pitch in 2009 that changed his, trajectory, the slider, but he throws 3 pitches. He mostly throws fastballs and sliders, glove side down. That's kind of what he's been doing, and he's just been kind of mastering this craft. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, he is unique even among that quartet in that, he has had to change over the years, but it's still at core. He does the things that he's always done, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to get a little more into that, like that stick-to-itiveness, that refusal to take I guess you would say the easier path, but I want to back out into the Dodgers now because they're one of the organizations that uses its legacy players to their advantage. You might have, look, when Oral Hershiser breaks down pitching on a game, he says things that nobody else says because he understands. And this will relate back to Kershaw. He talks about how your landing leg, your front leg, when you pitch, ends up being bigger than your rear leg because it just takes all that impact over the years and it just gets stronger. And so you have to balance these. This is Hershiser talking just, during a game. So you have Hershiser, and of course you have Koufax and Don Newcomb until he passed recently. These guys are all present. Tommy Lasorda, these guys were there, even though they weren't doing the day-to-day work of coaching and mentoring. And I don't know a lot of organizations there's some that do the Oriole way, and the Yankees have a bit of that. But what are your thoughts in terms of how the Dodgers shepherd a pitcher like Kershaw through hey, you're in the minors all the way up to, we're getting close to the end of your career?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's obviously really changed in the last 10 years, as the organization has, and under Andrew Friedman, and not changed for the worse or the better. It's just different. I mean, they're a very modern organization, but Kershaw is part of a lineage that dates all the way back to, Koufax in a lot of ways, you know, and if you talk, talking to someone like Rick Honeycutt, who, played for several teams, but describes, his experience playing for the Dodgers when he, came to spring training and learned from people, like Koufax, like, Ron Peronowski, these sort of like figures within the organization who really explain pitching to him, they sort of connect all the way. And so, like there's concepts that Koufax explained to, Honeycutt, like the idea of like hooking the seam on a slider and using your hand to create a vise to tighten the spin, that had been passed down, that when Kershaw was, sort of working on his slider in 2009, he used the same concept that Koufax had explained to Honeycutt, in the early 80s. And so there is, certainly like a lineage, and he's, he kind of is in a lot of ways the last link to that, just because pitchers are not raised to do the things that, he was. I mean, honestly, Walker Buehler fits that mold too. Walker Buehler is a guy who always took the baseball, put his body at risk in a variety of ways. And so I don't want to, denigrate what he's, accomplished as a Dodger. But, it's just the starting pitcher was once raised with this idea that you're supposed to, throw as many innings as possible to win games, to, take down, 200 innings a year as a, almost a mandatory sort of checkpoint. And now obviously it's dialed back in a variety of ways. And so, but yeah, the lineage you talk about Kershaw is obviously a huge part of it.
Yeah. And when you're talking about Peronowski, you're talking about Honeycutt and Koufax, these are all left-handers. And there is a unique language for the handedness within pitchers. And when you have greatness, Peronowski is a great coach. And obviously Koufax is a peer of Kershaw in terms of career level. Honeycutt can definitely coach a right-hander. It's not that he can't do that.
Sure.
But there is a language that those guys speak because the game is predominantly a right-handed game.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it. I mean, I think that it's probably, I think that Kershaw and Koufax probably would have forged some sort of connection if Kershaw threw with his right hand, but I think their relationship sort of transcends handedness, but it's certainly part of it, right? The fact that they have like a similar mix and a similar overhand curveball type thing. So yeah, that's part of it for sure.
So you talked to Sandy for the book, I'm assuming, or no?
I did, yeah.
Another guy that doesn't have like a perception about he being like rosy and approachable. So how was it approaching him to get him to talk about his friend Clayton Kershaw?
Yeah, it was that was one of the the cooler parts of doing the book was getting a chance to talk to him for a little bit. Koufax is obviously doesn't do interviews particularly regularly. He's kind of valued his privacy since his playing career ended, but I think it was a sort of situation where he cares about Kershaw as a person, as a friend, that despite their age difference, they're in contact relatively regularly. They'll go to dinner when, if they're at spring training together, that sort of thing. And so, I was able to spend a little bit of time with Koufax at Dodger Stadium and, get his perspective on Clayton, which I think was, really helpful for the book. And it was, and I think it demonstrated his level of affection for Kershaw, that he was willing to talk about him, because it's not like he was going to do a Zoom call with reporters right afterward. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I want to go back to the handedness and developing pitchers because, I mean, we have to bring up Julio Urias, right? And he comes up, you know, I don't know, what is it, like 15 years, almost 20 years really later than Kershaw, but he is from a different time. But in some ways, he was a bit of a throwback. It took him a while to get through. He got hurt early, but there is a difference there. Do we see the pendulum ever swinging back? I mean, someone like Greg Maddux proves that you can get people. Like Greg Maddux is an all-time great, but he proves that you don't have to throw 99 miles an hour to get guys out. And Kershaw proves this as well. Surely these people still exist. Urias was kind of in that same mold. Are there left-handers out there that can handle 200 innings a year and not have to throw? Like anytime you I watched a lot of baseball in my life. If you're throwing a ball 101 miles an hour and it's breaking 18 inches horizontally, your elbow is going to fall apart. Like that's just almost universally true. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are certainly different ways to get through, you know, a big league season. I think that the way that the industry is training pitchers now, they've incentivized velocity and they've incentivized, you know, putting as much movement as possible on off-speed pitches and, you know, these sort of designer pitches that are built in a lab. And I think that, you know, part of the sort of rising rate of elbow injuries is related to that. There's been a lot of reporting on that just in the past, you know, month or so. A lot of folks, you know, like Keith Meister, the Texas Rangers team physician, talking about how these sort of designer pitches, you know, the sweeper, things like that are, you know, sort of damaging elbows. And so it will be interesting to see if a pendulum swings back to, you know, valuing command and control type guys like a Hyun-Jin Ryu or Kyle Hendricks or, you know, whatever. But I think what a lot of folks in the game will tell you is that look at the numbers that those guys are putting up, you know, as command and control guys. They're getting their brains beat in sometimes. And the hitters have gotten really, really good. And so the pitchers, you know, have to compete, you know, the pitchers feel like it's necessary to, you know, push it into the red. But I think that I think that they're going to have to find ways to incentivize durability for pitchers in order to prevent sort of an onslaught of injuries. But at the same time, the worst thing that you can do for your arm is pitch. It's very unhealthy. It's not like pitching was healthy for you in 1987. You know, I do think, you know, people have described it as a crisis. You know, I think there's obviously real concern. It's something that baseball's trying to figure out, but it's not an easy thing. You know, it's easy to figure out what the causes are, but rectifying it, I think, is really challenging.
There was a time when the fork ball and the split-fingered fastball were wrecking shoulders. That was the belief, and we started getting away from that pitch. We do kind of go in and out of vogue on these things, but the more important point you make here is the gap between good and gone. It is just razor thin now. It used to be like someone like Dave Stewart could go out and work himself through a lineup several times, allow, I don't know, 1.3 on a whip, which is everybody hits and walks, you know, per innings pitch. And you could get by and be a Cy Young candidate doing that. I don't know that you could walk that line of 1.3 or higher and be in the league very long, because the hitters, as you said, have caught up, and not only caught up, but destroy pitches. And it's evidence of that. Go ahead. Yeah.
They make harder contact. You know, they tend to, you know, they've been incentivized to try and hit balls in the air and over the fence. And so, you know, lineups are constructed better so that there's not these like random dead spots in the lineup where like you have bad hitters in front of good hitters. You know, teams tend to stack their lineups better. And so, it's just harder to navigate 1 through 9 than it was, you know, 10, 15 years ago. And so I think that the way that has been, you know, the reason why teams keep basically training players and why the industry keeps training players to throw harder and harder is that, you know, it works. And I think what is interesting, though, is, you know, contrasting it with someone like Kershaw, who last year had the second lowest ERA in the sport besides Blake Snell and had a pretty much destroyed shoulder in the second half. So that does let you know that, you don't need velocity. You don't need the insane movement if you can do certain things well. Now, at the same time, though, like asking the industry to be like Clayton Kershaw, to be like Justin Verlander, to be like Max Scherzer, I mean, that's very challenging. And it's a lot easier to get guys to hulk up and throw as hard as possible, with this, six spin and all that type of stuff,
Yeah, and you get guys like, and I'm not in any way saying anything bad about any player, but you get a guy like Dan Uggla or any of these second basemen that all of a sudden started not just hitting home runs, but being left-handed and taking Kershaw deep. Here's an elite pitcher and a middling second baseman who's all of a sudden dangerous. And no matter how much home run prevention you try to have, the contact that used to go to the warning track, these are bigger, stronger guys.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of it is the hitters are just better. They train to hit the ball in the air. They train to hit the ball over the fence. And so, mistakes are punished worse. And so, there's just more of incentive to try and, not throw pitches that to get the idea of pitching to contact is gone out of vogue because contact is very dangerous now.
Yeah. As last season progressed, and, look, all these guys are just on the Dodgers, especially, but May comes back and instantly destroys his freshly repaired elbow. Gonsolin is clearly pitching in a compromised state, and Kershaw is doing the same thing. And you watch Kershaw pitch, and I watch pretty carefully. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's on a tightrope. Like the slightest mistake, and it'll be over. And you see when he gets to the playoffs, if you're watching, which I'm assuming you are because you're trying to write this story, I didn't want him to make that playoff start. I'm like, this guy's not healthy at all, and sometimes his stick-to-itiveness, his assertiveness that he needs to pitch is not always the right recipe.
Well, I mean, look, it's not like he lobbied to start game one of the postseason last year. They had no other options. And he had pitched well enough down the stretch. I mean, I think putting any sort of blame for what happened on him in the postseason last year, they had no other options. And he's Clayton Kershaw. He was willing to take the ball because they asked him to. He was going to continue pitching because, he felt that he could, do his best to, help the team. I mean, I don't know what he could have done differently against the Diamondbacks. Like, it wasn't an effort. Certainly you could execute better in some spots, but his arm was wrecked. And he was sent out there because the Dodgers did nothing at the trade deadline to improve their rotation. And they were forced to use a clearly compromised Kershaw who was willing to take the baseball. So I don't know if it was stubbornness or anything that really hurt him there. I think it was the health of his shoulder.
Yeah. Well, and he easily could have and probably should have said, hey, this thing's done. But again, this is like that, his desire to go out and
that's just not his nature. I mean, that's, it's not his nature to, just say, okay, I'm going to go get surgery. It's like, well, can I pitch through this? The doctors told him, yeah, you can try. And so he did. And in September, I don't know what the exact ERA was. It was a 2 something. Now, obviously, you're watching it, you're like, okay, this
was a perilous 2 something.
Yeah. But the job is to get outs. And that is what he was doing. And I think, obviously, right, you're watching it, you're like, man, he is really on a tightrope. At the same time, you look up and it's like, hey, 5 innings, 3 hits, no runs.
Yeah.
So, Brandon McCarthy used to, and Zach Greinke used to say that he had some sort of preternatural ability to just get people out. He has some sort of skill towards run prevention that they can't really explain. And that was, I think, what he did last September is the best example of that.
We should definitely talk about the playoff thing because he does put the team on his back over and over again. He does have the wide shoulders that can take that. He understands his responsibility and his place in the game. And when you look at certain aspects of his postseason numbers, they're fantastic. His whip is 1.11111. And that's with last year's blow up in there. His hits innings pitched. This is a guy that knows how to pitch in the postseason. And so many times, the Diamondbacks beat the Yankees back in 2001, just on a bunch of, short little weak hits. He wasn't Mariano Rivera wasn't getting hit hard. Right. And so Kershaw has this thing where it kind of just rolls out of control. But I wouldn't say it's fair to say he chokes. I would say that it's fair to say he's had some really bad luck. And a little bit of not executing. But I don't know. What is your sense, and how does he feel about it?
He doesn't love talking about it.
Yeah.
Understandably, I think a lot of it is, some of it is still very painful. Especially the World Series against the Astros is
Yeah.
particularly painful. But I think what was clear to me is there were maybe some things that were going on, in the early years about, especially like facing the Cardinals in 13 and 14 that might have been related to his pitch mix. There's still a lot of Dodgers people who believe that he was tipping, in 2013 and possibly 2014. I think that, sort of the stubbornness and the way that he sort of cut the plate really in half, the Cardinals were a good team who were able to key in on that. But then, as you go through the years after that, I mean, pitched well against the Mets in 2015. He gave up like inherited runners scored in that first start against the Mets. He threw on short rest 7 innings of 1-run baseball, to send the series to a game 5. No one cares about that because they lost game 5. Right. But no one ever talks about that. In 2016, he's coming off a major back injury, pitching on, sort of an insane amount of short rest in the first round. He runs out of gas in his last start against the Cubs. 2017, facing the Astros after a pretty successful postseason. We know kind of the subtext there. And then, in the subsequent years, he's dealing with injuries in 18, dealing with injuries in 19, pitched pretty well in 2020 in the postseason. So I think that it's not as simple as there's one explanation. I think there was definitely stuff early in his career that, definitely in conversation with AJ Ellis, they maybe would want to do differently against St. Louis. But mostly he's faced really good teams and had, one bad inning here or there. It's not like he's gone out and just got his brains beat in every October. It's like you get to the 6th inning and Don Mattingly doesn't have anyone in the bullpen who he thinks is better. So are you going to send a tired Kershaw or a mediocre reliever? Well, they're always going to choose a tired Kershaw. And then, so I think it's the numbers are what they are. Like he did what he did in the postseason. The book's not an attempt to defend that and, or anything like that, but it is, I do think that there's a lot more going on than just the basic, like, oh, this guy can't hack it in the postseason. There's so much evidence otherwise.
Yeah. And that's really, I think, where a lot of your focus in the book was. By the way, thanks for sending it to me. I appreciate everybody.
Yeah, sure.
This book right here. The last of his comedic in focus. There you go. And then there's the link right down below. And you know what I always say, buddy, read buy 2 and you're going to love it. It's fantastic. When we look at all of the things that go into a postseason game, there are so many areas where maybe the offense could pick up the team. I recall when they played the Cubs, they were in an elimination game, and Doc got the Cubs to bring Chapman in, and the Dodgers mounted a pretty significant threat against him. We're about to get him out of the game. If it had gone this way instead of that way, instead Chapman locked it down the rest of the way, and the Cubs win and eliminate them. But there's so many times where miraculous things happen. A ball hits the bag for the Giants, and everyone's safe, and it's just these crazy circumstances that mixes into this whole thing too. No one's going to blame it on a ball hitting the bag, but you're like, does anyone expect Pablo Sandoval to hit 3 home runs in a game? I mean, Tim McCarver's like, there's no way he can do this, then bam, the ball goes out. Luck is such a big part of it, but for fans, it's really tough to swallow luck. It's really tough to swallow the fact that everybody you're facing is good, and there's really just no room for error.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that, it's also, you're talking about a player who puts himself under incredible pressure, incredible strain all season long. There's some people with the team who believe that, he sort of faced had a kind of like emotional, not overload, but he had drained so much energy getting through, 5-6 innings that when he got to the 7th, he didn't have his normal reserves in ways that he would in the regular season. And those are things that, if the games that happened in 2013 and 2014 were managed the way baseball is managed in 2023 and 2024, we wouldn't be talking about what he did in the 7th inning because he wouldn't have pitched. Right. They would, there would have been relievers in there. But I also think that that's part of, fits into the title. I mean, he's really the last pitcher who's been expected to do this. He's the last pitcher who's been asked to, try and do that, the Bob Gibson thing, the Sandy Koufax thing. And I think his struggles in shouldering that have demonstrated why no one else in the industry has been asked to do it, because the rest of the sport said, well, if Kershaw can't do it, why are we going to make our guys try and do that? And they've come up with better ways to try and navigate games.
Yeah, that makes me think of the other guys who tried to take on the similar mantle, and it's just in the modern game, I just don't know that it's possible. But I love to ask, because I'm from California, right? I like all the teams. I like the Giants, I like the Dodgers. But would you rather have Madison Bumgarner's career or Kershaw's, right? One of those guys is going to the Hall of Fame, the other one's not. One of those guys has 3 rings and all kinds of postseason laurels. The other guy has this other reputation. And so it is an interesting question on what would you rather have?
Madison Bumgarner thinks Clayton Kershaw is the best pitcher who ever lived. So that should tell you.
Yeah. But he managed to shoulder that load for whatever reason, right?
Yeah, once. I mean, look, I don't want to shit on Madison Bumgarner, but come on. I mean, he was not particularly good in 2010 or 2012. He was the 4 starter in 2010. He had an incredible postseason in 2014. But he's never won a Cy Young. I think that what is interesting about Kershaw when you compare him to other good pitchers is that reputations are very hard to change. And if you go and do something like Bumgarner did in 2014, when he threw all those scoreless innings, came in relief. I covered the Royals in 2014, so I remember being I was at Kauffman Stadium when he came in the 5th inning, of Game 7, and I was just like, this guy's not gonna he's not gonna leave. He's just gonna pitch until the game's over. It was incredible. And when you do things like that, you become, a postseason hero. And it doesn't matter if you never get back to that stage. It doesn't matter if you never put together a regular season, that allows your team to get to that stage. You've done it.
Yeah.
Whereas with Kershaw, he's dealing with higher expectations. And so it doesn't matter that he did things, that he came in on 1 day of rest, with a herniated disc in his back to, save a game in 2016. That's expected of him. It's expected of him to go on short rest. And, it doesn't matter how well he pitched in the 2020 postseason when they won the World Series, because he already had the reputation, for what had happened before. It doesn't matter that everyone found out that, the Astros were using an illegal sign stealing system, because, reputations are very hard to change. And so, I think your question, while I understand it, one of those guys believes the other is the best ever. So I'd probably rather have Kershaw's career.
Yeah. He also gets to see, as he's growing up, he gets to see guys like Maddox coming out of the pen and Glavine coming out of the pen. And he knows within his organization, Hershiser puts the entire team on his back in '88. And it's, Hershiser and Mickey Hatcher, trying to win this thing. And so there is that thing where you're like, this is what we do, right? And whatever, we'll decide it on the field. And it's a remarkable thing in that it is really disappearing. There are guys that have elements of that. Again, Verlander's probably one of those guys, but you don't really want your best starter coming out of the pen on none or 1 day's rest. That just doesn't seem like that's going to be a thing that happens much at all anymore.
Yeah, and I would say Verlander's pitched on short rest once in his career. Once.
Yeah.
So, and he's had a wonderful career. He's going to finish, he might be the last pitcher to get 300 wins.
I think he's going to do it.
Yeah. But, no one else is even going to get 200 after him. So, but he's pitched on short rest once, Kershaw did it very often for quite some time. And he was asked to shoulder postseason burdens that, Roy Halladay, Cliff Lee, Justin Verlander, Zach Greinke, all these guys were not asked to do. The closest analog is CC Sabathia and Andy Pettit in 2009, maybe. The Yankees kind of rolled with mostly short rest. I think AJ Burnett did that as well. But the industry figured out this is not the right way to do it. We are better off doing it. We're better off running bullpen games and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. The bullpen game thing is common now, and you really can do quite a lot with the bullpen game. Yeah, and then I wanted to bring up Scherzer because we were talking about these guys that do step up, and he gives the appearance of someone that does that. But he also says, "Hey, my arm's overcooked," and these guys know their body way
Mhm.
better than a guy like Danny McClain ever did. Like they're not
Mhm.
putting poison into themselves. They don't live in a lead-filled world. They're being very, very careful with how they feel, and so they're like, "I am reaching my limit on this." Baseball's done a better job of understanding that, even to the point of saying, "Hey, let's get an MRI on that arm, make sure
Sure.
we're getting in front of an injury." And so, like I remember, I think it was Kuroda, somebody, no, Kente Maeda. They're like, "Hey, he's about to pull his hamstring," and they put him on the DL. Was there some roster chicanery there? Maybe, but
I think they were faking injuries back then, but yeah. I
they
think
are looking
manipulating the injured list, but okay. I'm pretty sure that
yeah,
I
yeah.
remember. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they were just making up stuff to get starters some day off back then. But yes, I do remember.
Yeah. Well, it's way different than like the Gary Sheffield's faking it, or Ricky Henderson doesn't really have a sprained hamstring and all. Like that sort of era is closed where we're like, "Hey, let's go take a look at it." We
Yeah,
might lie about what we find to the America,
well,
but
I
we're
just
going to
mean
go look
the
at it.
Dodgers at that particular era were on the cutting edge of
Yeah,
injury list manipulation. But yes,
yeah,
it has become a more preventative
mm,
time and more proactive about figuring out what's wrong and not telling pitchers to young pitchers to
yeah,
stay out of the trainer's room and things like that. And I think that's generally it seems like a it seems like progress
hmm
from a like human standpoint. At the same time, injuries are up, so it's not exactly preventing injuries. And I think that's just that's kind of they're basically close to guaranteed with the modern pitching style.
I want to back out and talk a little bit about the game. And look, I've been listening and reading Bill James's stuff for decades, so I'm all on board with understanding what happens on the field through analysis. But if you look just at that, like the performance and what luck looks like, and all these different numbers that we're trying to figure out, it does seem like we're compromising other aspects of the game. Pitcher arm health might be one of them. How about fan engagement too? Just moving players around and making it hard to root for. I like to enjoy how teams are managed and how the front office runs things, and those more than necessarily like the ball to bat action of the game nowadays, because it is a little hard to fall in love with a player like you could 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Obviously, the game's changed, but I'm not sure that the math is serving the game in a holistic way. It's very, in my mind, it's very peaky with its impact, but that impact is driving the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a consistent challenge for executives in that the strategies that are effective for winning baseball games, which is their primary objective, do not always correlate to making the game more fun to watch. And that
Yeah.
is the overall objective of the sport. It's entertainment. You want it to be a product that people like watching. And a lot of the strategies that have been proven to help teams win, whether it's infield shifts, the way bullpens are deployed, running platoons, lineup configuration.
Yeah.
Those are the sort of things that really go against some of the aesthetic, maybe not lineups, but some of the aesthetic enjoyment of the game that you theoretically have. And I think it's something that folks in baseball, specifically in the league office, have been very obsessed with in recent years. I do think the pitch clock has been a huge upgrade. It's made the product much better to watch. I mean,
Yeah.
there's very few. I know some players have been frustrated because I think it's contributing to the injury rate. I think it's too soon to say on that, but I think from a observer's perspective, the pitch clock is a huge upgrade. But yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge. And if you're a GM, is your job to win games, or is it to get people in the ballpark? And what GMs will tell you is the way you get people in the ballpark is you win games. Now,
Yeah.
the Tampa Bay Rays and the Oakland A's for quite some time, ran against that theory. But in general, right, the Texas Rangers won the World Series last year. They currently lead the American League in attendance, right?
Yeah.
Dodgers win 100 games every year. They lead, the sport in attendance. If you win, people will show up. And so what the GMs will tell you is like, let's try and win rather than try and build an enjoyable product. And if we can build an enjoyable product while building a winning team, hey, so much the better. But it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. Yeah.
That off the field analysis, you wonder how much, because they track data and other things too, like, their ability to sell season tickets, small packages, full packages. What does that look like? What zip codes do they, they're doing all of that. And so there's some level of the off the field game is, I wouldn't say it's 50% of the, of what the on-field game is, but there is so much competition for a guy like Bobby Gasparino is going to get hired away by somebody and be like, we're going to make this guy a GM because he finds incredible talent.
Yeah. I'm surprised he hasn't gotten more. Maybe that'll change, but yes, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. So that you're all competing for the same pool of brilliant minds, and then it's got to go together and make sense. And that's also not easy. I mean, the Mets are a classic example of, hey, we're going to spend a bunch of money. Sure. And then you're like, crap, that didn't work, right? And so it's not easy. I mean, half of the teams are going to be below average. That's just how this works, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's, sort of figuring out how to leverage, your sort of intellectual horsepower into building a winning club has been, one of the central challenges for executives in recent years, and like understanding, what is worth pursuing, what types of players, what sort of organizational philosophies you want to install, up through the chain. And, it's something the Dodgers are the best in the sport at. I think that's, fairly clear. I mean, we just did a project at The Athletic where we talked to 40 executives and around the game and asked them, who's the best front office, and the Dodgers, finished in first place by, pretty commanding lead. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating aspect of it for sure.
Yeah. And when you see that, you start to see all the, like, how do we poach these guys out of this organization and get some of what they've got? It is remarkable when you look at what a good GM is, or what a good owner is, or what a good fan base is, or how do you reliably build a fan base? The Cardinals are kind of going through a restructuring, and their fans are upset about how the team is performing, right? But normally the Cardinals are $3 million a year, easy, right? But I don't know that the A's will ever get there. The Oakland A's have never drawn $3 million. And they're not a regional draw in terms of, like, when they move around, they don't pull people in. And so how do you determine what a good owner is, what a good GM is? Okay, winning, great. But look, Charlie O'Finley, three times to the ALCS, or 5 times to the ALCS and 3 times winning world championship. He's seen as a bad owner. That's in 10 years, by the way.
Yeah. Is he seen as a bad owner? He wasn't seen as the best guy, but he was seen as pretty successful.
Okay, well, fair enough. Okay, maybe there's a difference there. I would say that Oakland fans, and again, I grew up in that area.
Yeah, sure.
Oakland fans feel like they've always had bad owners, except for Haas. But Haas only has the small window, and I'm going to be critical of the A's fans real quick because I do this on Twitter. They didn't show up, right? Like, of 104 win, 88, 40 Canseco team, they're 4th in the AL West in attendance, right? So how do we sort that out with, like, is a good owner good for these? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on? I mean, Carl Pohlad made all his money foreclosing on farms in Minnesota, right? Sure. And then didn't spend that money on his team. That's a pretty bad owner.
Yeah, I would say that in general, the ownership class of major American professional sports teams did not accrue their wealth in ways that should make us feel good as a society, right? Like, they probably did some stuff that made some people feel bad along the way. It's very hard to get $1 billion otherwise. I think once you leverage that money into owning a team, I think the way to be a good owner is to, hire people who run their departments with integrity, try and treat your people well in terms of, how they're paid, whether they're listened to, whether they are, entrusted with responsibility. I mean, so you take somewhere like the Tampa Bay Rays, right? Yeah. The Rays do not spend a lot of money on players. They do not draw particularly well at Tropicana Field, but there are a lot of people in baseball operations who would tell you that Stu Sternberg is actually a really good owner because they have a consistent culture. They have a pretty robust like scouting and player development staff. They tend to treat the people who work for their organization really well. People like working there. They feel like their voices are heard. And the team tends to be pretty competitive, most years. You contrast that with, what's going, like when Steve Cohen took over the Mets, right? And, obviously Steve Cohen made a ton of player acquisitions that caught a lot of people's eyes, obviously. But he also commissioned a study to find out what his employees were being paid compared to what like the league average was, right? And so tons of people who would work for the Mets just all of a sudden got raises because they were like, oh, well, the median salary for that job is, X amount more. Well, we got to bump that up, And so there's things like that owners can do. That's not just, but the thing that fans most care about is whether they entrust the front office to like execute good baseball decisions, pay for free agents, all that sort of stuff. And like, I understand that, getting the big stuff right, for example, is like the thing that the Dodgers do as well as anyone, signing Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman and Shohei Ohtani can paper over a lot of mistakes. But in terms of building a culture, there's a lot of smaller things that owners can do that can be really effective.
Yeah, in so many ways, Major League Baseball is great at what they're going to do. You can't get a ticket to that Willie Mays Birmingham, Alabama game that's going to happen in June. Like that thing's going to be packed to the gills. They're in Mexico City this past week. London's coming up. They're always moving around and doing things that are very exciting and draw a lot of attention to the game worldwide. It's the most diverse major sport in terms of the countries that play in it. I mean, there's hundreds of players in the history of baseball from Venezuela. That surprises people when they hear that. Dominican Republic has the second most players. I mean, they produce a ton of talent. So in so many ways, they're doing great. They're expanding. I know the Dodgers have an academy in Africa. So there's a lot of that. But in other parts, man, I mean, when I go to a game, and I go to some games, but it's hard to pay full freight for a decent seat and a bit of food,
Yeah, it's not cheap. It's not cheap, going to Dodger Stadium and getting the $33 Korean barbecue bowl. Like, I get it. I paying for parking, dealing with getting out of Chavez Ravine, paying for a $20 turkey sandwich at AT&T Park or whatever. Oracle, they call it Oracle now. Yeah, I mean it's
yeah.
It's the same, it's City Field. Like it's expensive. So I am empathetic to fans who would rather just watch on the couch because it's not cheap. It's not cheap getting parking in the Bronx. If you're driving in, you don't live in the city. All that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And fans, a lot is being asked of fans. When I'm hard on the A's fans, I'm also gentle with the fact that it is the Alameda County area and its adjacent counties. The tax load for those people is enormous. And they've got real things to pay for instead of ballparks. And so when they're like, hey, we don't want to pay for that, they get to say that. And then the owner gets to decide if he wants to keep his business there or not. And it's very contentious in a place like Oakland, because they would rather protest an owner than go to a game and celebrate a winner, right? And there's something in the ideology of the area that doesn't allow them to foster and grow. The Dodgers are, I don't know, maybe it's so diverse in LA that you can draw from a big group of people. I don't know if you must have been there on Tuesday nights when the mariachi band is there, and how incredible that is. Every stadium needs a thing like that where people just want to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't want to get too deep into the Oakland situation because it's really complicated.
It is.
I think it's a bummer for their fans.
It is
losing the franchise, and it's pretty clear that their ownership group has not done right by the city and the community. But yeah, I mean, like, look, the Dodgers have created like a financial colossus. It starts with the baseball team, obviously, but they've done a lot to renovate the stadium, for example, in ways that John Fisher's group has not done at Oakland Coliseum. They, like, the stadium 15 years ago was not great. And now, they have working like elevators, which is great. They didn't they didn't always have that. Now the food is better. The sight lines are better. The lighting is better. They've invested a lot in basically, refurbishing the brand. The Guggenheim Group has. And so, and they're being rewarded for that. They're in a phase where they're experiencing, something called reputational luck, where they're in a position for good things to happen to them.
Yeah. DJ Severe is widely regarded as the best DJ in major leagues, and that sound system, it's incredible, right? Just that
it's
part
loud.
of it. Yeah, it's loud. Yeah. And he does a great job. It is loud.
It's loud.
I want to go back to Kershaw because obviously we're talking, look, here's your book.
There it is.
The Last of His Kind, you guys. And there's the link down below, you guys. Definitely check that out. And if you like baseball or the Dodgers at all, you're going to love Andy's work. When you look at someone like Kershaw, who's very programmatic, like you talked specifically about how his foot would fall in the same spot on the mound because he's just a metronome. Yeah, it's curious to me, like, how do you evolve as a player, right? How do you make that Verlanderian switch or that Greinke switch when you're a guy who puts his foot down on the same damn spot, on the same damn mound? It is very hard to teach that dog new tricks, but throughout the book, you kind of indicate that Kershaw does soften on the stance. And I've heard him say, I used to be mad at the numbers, but it turns out the Dodgers are right on these numbers. And so I have to pay attention.
Yeah. I mean, I think that his stubbornness, it's not that he is immediately resistant to new information. I think that he wants to be sure before he makes a decision to change things. And part of it is because he'd been so successful for so long that there was no reason to change. When you were as good as he was, why would you do things differently? And it really wasn't until his body kind of stopped cooperating in 2018 and 2019 that he became more, interested in some of the information that they were presenting. He showed the willingness to go to Driveline and, do some work there to, build up shoulder strength and, take a few things to tweak his delivery. And, but when you're pitching every season with a 2 ERA, and you're winning the Cy Young, why would you change that? And I think but the reckoning with not being able to just do the things that had once not come easily, but that he had been able to do, over and over and over. I mean, that's kind of one of the central questions of the book is how do you change without losing sight of what makes you great?
Yeah. And if you want to put his peak, it's probably somewhere in the middle of that 2016 season before his back does give out. Because he was going 8 or 9 innings, 10 plus strikeouts, and 1 or no runs, just like at a historic rate. And then all of a sudden, because they all battle something, right? But it became too much for him to bear, and he had to start missing games, which I know that has to drive him crazy to miss a game.
It doesn't make him happy. Yeah, it doesn't make him happy. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, that period from about 2011 till when he injured his back in June of 2016. I mean, he was, it's the best peak, we've seen outside of maybe, Pedro for a period of time in the late 90s, Randy Johnson in the early 2000s. It's up there, just that level of dominance.
It's as high as anybody can ever hope to get. I mean, you want to pick Pedro over Clayton or Clayton over Maddox, whatever. But all of these, we're talking the best pitchers in the last almost 100 years now.
Well, it was amusing, and this is not to slight Jacob deGrom, but it was amusing to me when, after he put together those excellent seasons, I believe it was in 18 and 19, that there was a lot of discourse about when was the last time there's been a pitcher this dominant. It was like Kershaw for 5 years, twice as long as this guy, just 2 years ago, it stopped, and he's still really good. It just was it's very interesting how quickly, there's always a, search for it's like, there's people writing that, Patrick Mahomes is the greatest of all time. And it's like, we just saw Tom Brady.
Yeah.
Wait
a minute.
But, there's a need to sort of, have fresh characters and things like that.
Yeah. So in the book, you talked about something I didn't know about, and I really enjoyed reading it because I'm a big fan of, and I don't know why, it's just a dumb Pete thing, but when the Royals signed George Brett to a lifetime contract, I thought, that's what you do with that special player. Now, George Brett would have been and has been a great bet for the Royals for that. But the Dodgers come to him with a lifetime contract, and he pushes away from it. One, how does, and maybe you don't know, but how does the MLB Players Association handle that? And two, how do you reckon with that? I mean, this sets you up financially, and you're going to obviously be part of this franchise forever. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the union was fine with it if, the player wants the deal. So, and it wasn't a lifetime deal. It was 15 years, 300 million. And so there was like a terminus to it. And yeah, his perspective on it was that he did not want to commit to a length of time that he didn't know that he could do. Essentially, he understood that the sport was causing him, intense stress, physical pain, like sort of emotional toil. And he didn't want to commit to having to, feel like he had to be there. We were talking about this, I think it was in the winter of 2022. And he was like, can you imagine? I'd still have 6 years left on that. The idea of
Right.
like, and he wanted to get to the point where he's at now, where he has the freedom to go year to year to, if he wants to come back, he can come back. And if he doesn't want to come back, he can walk away. And so, I think it was an interesting gambit by the Dodgers to get their tax number down below what it ended up being on the deal. And he ended up, he signed for, I think it was 7 years, 215 million. So it's not like he got cheated financially,
Right.
and then subsequently, I think his next deal was like 93 million after he opted out, after whatever. He's made the money, and he's made it in a shorter amount of time, but it was just he just did not want to commit to something that he didn't feel like he could live up to.
You think that's common? Like if you offered that contract to any other elite pitcher, do you think they would do the same thing as Kershaw, or is Kershaw last of his kind in terms of that stuff too?
I don't know. I mean, all those situations are different. When is the player being offered the deal? What's their level of commitment to the franchise? I mean, another part of it is in 2013, the team hadn't been to the postseason since 2009. He wasn't sure if the Dodgers are going to be good. Looking back on it now, it's like, oh, you're about to start this, sort of run of dominance. They've won the division every year but once, during that time. And, they've been to the World Series several times and all that stuff. But at the time, it was just like, I don't know if we're going to be any good. I don't know if I want to play for a team that's, winning 82 games every year. So I think it just depends. You see some players, or, Will Smith just signed a deal that was, pretty clearly sort of it's good for him financially. He gets 140 million, but it's also pretty team friendly, a 10-year deal for a player Will Smith's caliber that, I think but they were able to, I don't want to take advantage, makes it seem kind of nefarious, but they were able to strike a deal that, satisfied what Smith wanted, while still being able to, get themselves some CBT relief with the sort of AAV. So I think it just depends, player to player.
Yeah. Do you see Kershaw? I know Kershaw's got a little bit of a contract now. I guess what are your thoughts on his comeback, this summer potentially? And then do you see him ever doing a final year with the Rangers just to, do that, to stay close to home?
I think that this past year was probably the closest he's come to signing with Texas. And the fact that he came back to LA and has a player option for next year, I would be pretty surprised if he went to Texas, but, he's also going to have the freedom to be able to try and make it work. It's an odd situation this winter where the Rangers kind of didn't have any money, as well. They had money, but their owner was unwilling to spend it because they were dealing with some issues with their, TV contract. And so they weren't able to, really make a serious offer. And the Dodgers, did, and have presented him a chance to, come back mid-season and, be an important contributor to what looks like yet another super team. At this point, given how this past winter went, I would be pretty surprised if he ever signed with Texas, but I wouldn't totally rule it out.
Yeah. You talk a little bit about his relationship with the team, with Doc. It's, you want it to, on the surface, you look out, and Formula One's great at this also. Like, we've made a unified statement, we're all, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of anger. There's, a lot of competitive people trying to do what they think they need to do to make the team great. And I don't want to act like there's like a bad relationship there, but it's not been a bed of roses for Kershaw or for the Dodgers as they've gotten to know each other more and more over the last 15, 16 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just challenging. I think that it's rare for great players to always be on the best of terms with their teams. I mean, look at, The Last Dance with Michael Jordan. I mean, look at how Derek Jeter's career finished up with the Yankees. I mean, I think it's always challenging to navigate that sort of final stage as the player, enters a different phase of his career, but still sort of has the expectations of how things have been done around the team. And and specifically his relationship with Roberts has had its ups and downs over the years. I mean, there's been problems with communication. I think that they've never been as close as maybe Roberts would have liked. Roberts is pretty open in the book about how Kershaw kind of keeps him at a distance, and Kershaw is fairly open about some of the reasons why. He's a private person, and I think it would have been very challenging for any manager to navigate the injuries and things that Kershaw was dealing with in the second half of the 2010s, and Kershaw sort of reckoning with the new normal for what his body was capable of doing. And as Roberts talks about, it's the idea of how do you protect someone from themselves when they're not willing to acknowledge that they need to be protected. And that is the sort of push and pull that they've really been, dealing with. And, and it kind of resurfaced a bit last year where, Kershaw's clearly compromised. His shoulder's a mess. He's not able to play catch without feeling pain, but he's still going out there. And Roberts, was fairly open about like, well, Clayton's, his body's just, it's not, we're fighting through it. He's dealing with some stuff.
Yeah.
And Kershaw at one point went to him and said, just tell them I stink. Like, tell them I'm bad at baseball. Don't tell them I'm hurt,
Yeah.
And I think that that's just an interesting sort of, Roberts looks at it as I'm trying to protect him. I'm trying to explain, why he looks like this. And Kershaw's point was, I don't want people to think that I'm vulnerable. They need to believe they're facing me. They need to believe they're facing Clayton Kershaw, not, as I wrote in the book, a 35-year-old man with an 88-mile-an-hour fastball and a wrecked shoulder, And you saw that with Arizona to an extent, right? I really believe that Arizona's scouting reports were pretend this is someone else.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Don't pretend it's just another guy. You're not facing Kershaw. You're just facing a guy. And how would you take those at bats? And I think that was, you could see it in their confidence, and they were just taking vicious hacks against him in a way that, normally teams just do not when they're facing him.
Mark Pryor being the pitching coach now for Honeycutt, but Mark Pryor goes through a thing where his body can't withstand it. He watches Kerry Wood, same thing. These are electric guys, but bodies just not built to do a long major league career. How does he work with Kershaw and his desire to do something that he wasn't able to do?
I mean, I think that in some ways the biggest challenge for Pryor was that he was replacing Rick Honeycutt, who was someone Kershaw was very, very close with, and one of the people he really trusted around the team. And so trying to be respectful of that relationship, and talking to Honeycutt about how to work with Kershaw was something that Pryor really, for lack of a better term, prioritized, when he transitioned into that, full-time pitching coach role, moving from the bullpen coach after 2018. And so I think, players really like Mark Pryor. They really, really like him. He's someone who has a real, for one, the modern player, and maybe this is a little different with the younger generation, but most players are like, holy shit, that's Mark Pryor, even though he dealt with all those injuries, he still is Mark Pryor. And I think that buys him instant credibility. He does a really good job of explaining complicated concepts in language that they understand and knowing how to connect with different pitchers. Like, for example, Kershaw hates talking about mechanics. He doesn't like the idea of you should be here, you should be there, you should think about this, think about your lead leg, your front hip, all this. No, he likes simple sort of declarative suggestions. And Pryor learned through that, from Honeycutt, essentially, how to speak to these different players. And that's one of the things I think Mark does pretty well in that role.
Yeah. No, that's great. And he definitely is his own character. I remember one of the things I read one time, it might have been written by you, I'm not sure, but it kind of compared and contrasted Greinke's process to Kershaw's. And Greinke's like, I think I'm going to have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and roll around on that rubber thingy over there. Where Kershaw's like, from this minute to this minute, and just that difference is, that kind of goes to the whole thing of like, how do you manage these people? I don't want to take any more of your time. You're welcome to close on that in a second here. I just want to say this one more time. The last of his kind. If you're the kind of person who's like, hey, these new pitchers don't pitch very well, well, then you want to read this book because this is the one, the last one there is.
Yeah, that's Kershaw. It. It's all over after this. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything in closing? Otherwise, I'm going to kick you out of here and let you get on with your day. And thank you so much for coming.
Hey, thank you for having me. This was really fun. I'm glad we could hit a bunch of different stuff. Yeah, no, if folks want to order the book, the link is there. If you want to use Amazon, go for it. If you bookshop, local, your bookshop.org, your local indies, Barnes & Noble, whatever's easiest to get it, go for it. I hope people like it. It's, worked really hard on it, and I'm hopeful that people get a chance to read it in the next couple weeks.
Yeah, I hope everybody does get it. I really enjoyed it. And what's next? On to the next thing. Screw that book. No, seriously, thank you so much. I'm going to wrap this up. I'll come back and say bye to you in a second.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you